Really, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the industrialization of the field at one point. The great work that Form's doing as a leader in AI, I think, is a good example of some of that. But really, I'm going to share a few high-level thoughts on the sector. So we're a nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C. We've got a couple of employees over in Europe, but about 28 people between the U.S. and Europe. About half of those folks are based in Washington, D.C. in our headquarters. We represent over 400 members, and they're anything from small private biotech companies to public biotech companies, all the way up to larger pharmaceutical companies, global companies, Novartis, Pfizer, J&J, what have you. We've got a couple dozen patient organizations. Those are mostly rare disease patient organizations. About as many of the prominent academic medical centers that focus on cell and gene therapy, and a lot of the important tools, strategic suppliers, service providers, many other great organizations. And we really focus on a few things: convening the sector, advancing the kind of field through data and analytics, and I'll show some data on the field, engaging a lot of diverse stakeholders. And then a lot of it's about how do we think about enabling these advanced therapies and really modernizing healthcare systems. And I'll share some thoughts on that. And we like to think that our true north really should be those patients. And as I say to people, why is that, right? Because if you think about it, if you're taking a gene therapy, a gene editing medicine, a cell therapy, you're not in a good way, right? We're not modulating someone's blood pressure. These are oftentimes life and death diseases, or very serious diseases where people will have premature death, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. Okay, maybe let's start with some data. So if you go back in time, I was on a panel some years ago when I was involved with the American Society of Gene and Cell Therapy, ASGCT. I was on a panel with a guy named Ted Friedman. Who in this room has heard of Ted Friedman? Oh, good. Got one. Okay. So I looked Ted up because they were like, he was the chair of the ASGCT Ethics Committee, and I was chairing the Government Affairs Committee at the time. And people said, no, he's like a really interesting guy. And he's considered by some to be one of the godfathers of gene therapy. He apparently wrote, it's what some people say is the first definitive paper that expressed a view that you could use gene therapy to treat rare human genetic diseases. And it was published in 1972. So if you think about whether it was 1970, 1972, 1974, the arc of going from some interesting scientific progress, but not a lot of clinical progress, right, for many decades, right? The setback with Jesse Gelsinger, and then finally what we get to, there were a few big inflection points, but 2017 is certainly a big inflection point when Spark got their Luxturna gene therapy medicine approved, right? So you go many, many years to 2017, and then what did we see? Over the span of 5 years, we saw 5 gene therapies approved in the U.S. for rare genetic conditions, right? Pretty good. Nothing for 40 plus years, right? And then 5 in 5 years is pretty good. In 2023, we saw 5 approved in 1 year, right? A real burst of innovation that I think is quite notable. I won't go through all the medicines that are up here, and this was a little bit of a glimpse of, can we get closer to the FDA vision some years ago that we could see somewhere between 10 to 20 new gene therapy and cell therapy medicines approved per year. That's not going to happen this year. It looks like we could get up to 7 approvals in the U.S., between the U.S. and Europe approved, which is good. That's still good progress, but it's not the 10 that we had hoped to see. And here's sort of the quickie view of 4 have been already approved. These are gene therapies, right, as opposed to cell therapies. We've got 3 that with decisions pending, so up to 7 approvals. Plus, we've got some that have been punted into next year. So next year actually looks like it could be a pretty good year as well. So good progress. This data is getting a little bit long in the tooth. I think we're a couple of weeks out from releasing our Q3 data, but this is the best data that we have, which really takes a look around the globe at how many biotech, pharmaceutical companies, academic centers are actually doing clinical trials, right? So you see 2,900 around the globe led by the US, but Asia Pacific doing pretty well, Europe lagging a little bit behind, but doing okay. So those are the developers. Clinical trials, over 1,800 around the globe. Great, right, in service of these patients for whom there aren't a lot of great alternatives. And then investment, of course, for the last few years has been a very, very difficult financing environment, as I'm sure many of you know. We have seen more investment in the sector. Now, a lot of it's not the early stage investment. A lot of it's going to more advanced companies, clinical companies, but we saw $4.2 billion in the quarter led by the US at $3.8 billion. So some good numbers there. Okay. I'm going to just take a few minutes to talk about, kind of shift gears a little bit. We kicked off a project. We started working on this at the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine last year, and then we really formalized it a bit more this year, which is, I've got kind of a very strong view that we need to do a much better job engaging a lot of very important stakeholders than what we have seen in the past with sort of the traditional pharmaceutical companies, the biotech companies, and whatnot. And to do that, I think you've got to grapple with some thorny issues and deal with some elephants in the room, and I'll explain that, right? So the first is, and this is something we talked with our board about, we kind of kicked this off in January of this year, which is, hey, look, there's a lot of people we really care about, and we give them special names. We call them patients, patient organizations, caregivers, right? Policy leaders. I know today's an interesting day to talk about that, but we spend a fair amount of time burning some calories up on Capitol Hill and inside, talking to folks inside the administration. Payers, think about CMS, Medicaid, Medicare. Over in Europe, these health technology assessment bodies, regulators, FDA, EMA, MHRA, right? Religious leaders, bioethicists, media, investors, right? And when we engage with them, they ask some pretty good questions typically, right? Like, and almost invariably, the first one is like, why are these things priced at $2 to $4 million? Like, you know, as I said to our board, I'm like, we have to be able to talk about this topic. I'll get to this on the next page. It's an elephant in the room. Like, I think credibility just bleeds out if you just say, well, it's all about value, and, you know, basically, humana. Like, it just doesn't. I don't think it works, and I was like, I'm not doing it. So we need to be able to talk about that. They also ask legitimate questions about, like, look, at $2 to $4 million in CAR Ts at $350, $375 to $500,000 or more, you know, can these health systems actually afford these today and into the future? Fair, right? Will only the wealthy people in the wealthiest countries have access to these therapies? Will only the wealthy countries have access to these therapies, right? Hasn't gotten lost on people that 80% of the world's sickle cell patients are not in the US or Europe, right? How about ultra-orphan disorders, right? It's not a great business model if you've got 500 patients, 200 patients, and you're going to only see them once, right? It's confounding to the field. How do we think about that? How well regulated is the science? Is it over-regulated? Is it under-regulated? There's still a lot of rogue stem cell clinics. And then there are some, you know, miscreants out there that have done some kind of dramatic experimentation. I happened to be in Hong Kong when the Chinese scientist, Dr. He, announced these gene-edited twins. It was a pretty shocking period, right? That was November of 2018. So, you know, how do we think about needed guardrails around the science, which I think is a fair point that it certainly comes up in our world. So with all that, we put together a project that we kicked off. It's a multi-year effort to look at some of these most complex issues, and some we're a little further along on. Some will take more time. I can talk about that, but they get to, I think, the heart of a lot of things that are big and important within our field, right? Like, how do we really think about, how do we talk about pricing and value and the tricky balance between high innovation, right, access, and sustainability? And we've had some, I would say, some good, very good, and sometimes spirited discussions with our colleagues within CMS about this. And I can talk about that if people are interested in that more during the Q&A. I mentioned earlier, how do we think about the industrialization of the field? There's been a lot of progress that's been made to date, a lot of progress over the last decade, right? But there's a lot more to be done to drive down costs, drive up yields, to think about, you know, treatment centers and how to actually pull these therapies through so they're not just the purview of some people that can get to a big academic center. But if you think about CAR T therapies, how do you better democratize the technology and get them into clinics that can handle them, that are bring the actual product to the patient a little bit more? I think there's a lot of work to be done on that, especially if you think the fact that About 20% of the people that are eligible, sort of CAR T appropriate, are actually getting on therapy, right? There's a lot of improvement to be done there. And how will all that industrialization, I think, ultimately aid an effort to try to democratize the technology more, to move it into other countries? A lot of people don't know Zolgensma for SMA from Novartis is available in 50 markets around the world. It's pretty good. Gene therapy available in 50 markets, including Brazil, Ecuador, Egypt, a lot of non-traditional markets, right? There's a lot of important work being done on in vivo sickle cell treatments. So someday, hopefully, you could actually bring those therapies much more closely to the patient populations in Africa, India, and other parts of the world, right? There are lots of challenges. I won't get into how we're thinking about that now, but on the ultra-rare disease model, it is a very, very tricky challenge. And then we're doing some work on what we call scientific engagement, which is code word for explaining the science to lots of those stakeholders that we talked about. I think that might be needed probably more than ever. And then how do we think about needed guardrails for this sort of frontier technologies? But I'm going to drill into the first one just because I think this comes up so often, pricing, value, how do you think about these things? And it's worth just a few slides, and at the end I've got some QR codes I'll flash up that we've put some paper together. But it is a big thing, right? You price a gene therapy at $2 to $4 million, people are going to raise a couple eyebrows, right? Like it's an elephant in the room that I think is important to be able to talk about. And so we laid out earlier this year a framework that specifically looked at gene therapy. We later updated it to cell therapy, but gene therapy is a little bit more, the pricing is a little bit more controversial. And we laid out these 5 different factors that they target devastating, often deadly diseases. These are super expensive diseases that we're targeting. These therapies tend to be very effective if you actually make it all the way through. They're not perfect. There are questions about durability. I get it. There's a lot of things that come up. But by and large, for the right patient population, these tend to be very effective therapies. They provide a lot of value to the healthcare system. And the numbers that either we've crunched or we've seen crunched with others lead us to conclude that they are very sustainable, at least for the next few years, I would argue through 2030, even before taking into cost offsets, and I'll unpack that a bit. Okay. So look, these gene therapies are targeting very deadly disorders, right? The average life expectancy for the rare diseases for the approved gene therapies in the US is less than 40 years, right? It's about half the normal life expectancy. And when you look at some of these, the sort of longer ones are things like sickle cell disease. Now, I don't know about you, but I've met a bunch of sickle cell disease patients over the years, 10, something like that. I know of 3 that passed away in the last few years, and they were all younger than me. 2 were in their 30s, and they looked like a portrait of health, right? It's a horrible disease. It doesn't get discussed enough. That, yeah, there's pain crises. People, I think, understand that. It leads to premature death, right? The average age is somewhere between 45 to 55. There's some studies that say 40 is closer. It's a bad disease, right? CALD, 10 years old. Duchenne muscular dystrophy, 22 years old, right? So we're dealing with very, very serious disorders, right? These also happen to be very, very expensive diseases to treat with the standard of care, right? The lifetime cost to manage these things often can be up into the millions of dollars, right? Patients with severe hemophilia B, over $20 million, right, in lifetime healthcare costs. Patients with severe sickle cell disease, $4 to $6 million. Patients with transfusion-dependent thalassemia, over $5 million. And again, these are the patients that are more appropriate for gene therapies. If you're a well-managed patient with hemophilia, you're on clotting factor, you're probably doing fine, you're good, right? Like, you don't need necessarily to be on gene therapy, but there is a tail of these patients that are breakthrough patients, and they are the ones that are more appropriate for treatment, right? So very, very expensive diseases. These orphan gene therapies also are pretty effective. They get approved at a much, much higher rate than your standard small molecule or monoclonal antibody when you kind of pull everything through. Now, this data is going to be updated. We worked with our colleagues here in the Boston area at Tufts University. They put together some really good data that we released a little over a year ago. That's this data. They're updating that in real time. We hope to have it published in a major peer-reviewed journal some point in the spring, late Q1 or into Q2. But basically, they took a look at some good background data from both IQVIA and from Bio and compared approval rates within cell and gene therapies. and this is the data I'm showing is about orphan gene therapies, but it's about a 48% greater likelihood of success in phase 1, 65% in phase 2, and 30% in phase 3. So pretty effective therapies. And when you look, of course, at the actual disease states and the therapies, the data, I think, tells a pretty good story. We think that these therapies also provide pretty strong value for healthcare systems overall. We work very closely with ICER. I did Ted Friedman. Who's heard of ICER? ICER, Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. They're based here in Boston. No one's heard of ICER. Okay. So if you're in the payer world, like the CMS world, thinking about plans, they're a very influential group. They are sort of like akin to a health technology assessment body in the U.S. They look at all modalities, small molecules, monoclonal antibodies, drugs that get approved, and they give a lot of companies a pretty rough ride and say, that's not good value for the money for the healthcare system. You're making some good improvements, but compared to the standard of care, you shouldn't be pricing this therapy this high. We think it should be priced much lower down like this. Well, there's one area they've carved out where they think these therapies are like a screaming deal, and that's gene therapy and cell therapy. So we like that. We like that quite a bit. But they think, you could easily price a drug for SMA at around $2 million, sickle cell $2 million, and MLD $4 million. So a lot of value for the system, and related, right? Like there's all these savings that they have articulated that you can capture. Why? Because these diseases are so expensive. Again, remember I said $20 million for hemophilia B, $4 to $6 million for severe sickle cell patients, right? So for hemophilia A, their number crunching is like, look, these therapies would be cost effective even if you priced it at $6.7 million. Hemophilia B up to $9.9 million. It's a lot. And then within within the list prices, approved gene therapies, hemophilia A 2.9, hemophilia B 3.5, not including rebates. And then this is one that I've spent more time on this last point probably than any other topic. And if there's one thing you could take away today from my talk in thinking about pricing, this should give you some comfort, right? Which is, and we've spent some significant time with CMS on this point as well, which is these gene therapies, take all these gene therapies, gene editing medicines, separate cell therapy for now, stack them all up one on top of another, and look out to 2030. The total cost, the total revenue that we're talking about is $7.5 billion, right? Now that's not nothing, but context is very, very important, right? That is about 0.1% of projected healthcare spending in 2030. It is 1.3% of projected prescription drug spending in 2030. It's 1.8% of the economic burden of rare diseases in the U.S. This is data that the Every Life Foundation has put together over some years, right? So the standard of, even with the standard of care, the burden of rare diseases is extremely high on society, right? And we've delved into this one a little bit more than we can show in this box, but as I've said to countless payers that I've talked to, including some of the senior guys at CMS, look, why don't I ever hear people screaming about the standard of care in other areas? One-time, potentially transformative therapies. There's 3,500 lung transplants in the U.S., and they go for about $1.6 million. When was the last time you heard, we can't afford lung transplants? You never hear that, right? An allogeneic bone marrow transplants, over $1 million, about 10,000 of those in the U.S. Double lung transplants, I think, are about 1.3 million, and there's like 5,000, more than 5,000, right? There's a lot when you add it all up. And there's a lot of other medical interventions that are very expensive. Premature babies, right, that are in the NICU for months. A lot of us know people, friends, family members that have had these really kind of tough pregnancies. I mean, these are $1 million, $2 million a pop. So, I think it's helpful to have some context that this system will not go bankrupt. It will not implode. If you're talking about 1.3% of prescription drug spending, again, not next year, not in 2026, in 2030. So plenty of time to plan and prepare, right? And by the way, when you look at the GLP-1 therapies and a lot of Keytruda, a lot of other big blockbusters, these are $15, $20 billion a year therapies, right? So I think there is ample, this data suggests, if you set the emotion aside, there's ample headroom to digest these gene therapies. Okay, as I said, a couple QR codes. People want to nerd out, follow this stuff more. I gave a talk at JP Morgan where I laid a lot of this out in January of last year. And then we put together, I think, some pretty good paper on this that includes cell therapies as well. So if people want to nerd out, they can go there. Two last slides, just on, I mentioned at the outset, like we think a lot about modernizing healthcare systems. I think there is a lot of good news out there. I'm setting this, not to get into people's political views about the election, but when we look at how things are going in the U.S., we see a good case for optimism. CMS has put together a partnership, a voluntary model for sickle cell disease, where they're trying to enable value-based payments, so maybe payments over time, or if the therapy looks like it works, you pay up front, and if it doesn't seem like it's going to hit some clinical milestones over a few years, you rebate back the money. That's a big thing within our community. Why? Because a lot of patients, if you have a rare genetic condition, you're on Medicaid. A lot of our population, probably 2/3 of the sickle cell patient population. And to do these value-based, outcomes-based agreements, they're really important, but they're very complex to administer. And if you're a small state, it's really hard to put together. California can figure it out. New York can figure it out. Massachusetts, you get to rural states, much smaller states, it's not going to work so well. So essentially CMS has come in and said, what if we did it? We could do that, and states could volunteer to be part of our consortium, and the companies can volunteer and try to get in as well. It's an efficiency tool. We think it could be a good glimpse of positive things to come on the reimbursement side. And then another busy slide, I'll just hit the highlights, right? The FDA, I think, doesn't get enough credit for their efforts over the last few years to continue to improve, get better, do more hiring, right? Peter Marks is, in my view, has been an outstanding head of CBER, and he hired Nicole Verdun. People may recall a couple of Augusts ago it got announced. She's done a terrific job. She's a good friend of ours, as well as Rachel Anatol as her deputy. So they're building out that senior team that's really needed. They've hired much more aggressively. They've had a lot of turnover. PDUFA 7 gave them a lot more headcounts. They've been hiring. They also have to train people when they get hired, right? It takes time, but we're really appreciative of the work that they've done. They've also leaned in Washington, D.C. Everybody wants to burn down accelerated approval. They've done a very good job of leaning in and saying, no, not in this case. In the case of gene therapies, in the case of rare diseases, it is a very important tool, and we are highly aligned with that. And they've piloted some really important programs like their Operation Warp Speed for rare diseases called the START program that we think are very positive. So with that, I know I'm standing between everybody and lunch, but I'm happy to take questions and attempt to answer them. By the way, I'm a reformed lawyer by training, so science questions are going to be kind of not right in my wheelhouse.